Thanks very much, Hugh. Good afternoon, everybody, again, and welcome to MEGALITHOMANIA. As you said, I'm Chris Morton, this is Ceri Louise Thomas, and some of you may have already heard of our book called The Mystery of the Crystal Skulls. I don't know how many people here might have already heard of it or read it. Oh, that's great, yeah. Well, it's actually in the Daily Mail today. There's a big extract from our book, a summary, really, of our book, which we're very pleased about. And we're also very pleased, of course, about the fact that there's a big Indiana Jones movie about to come out about crystal skulls, which most people seem to have heard of. That's due, the world premiere for that's tomorrow, and then the UK premiere is on Monday, and then it'll be in cinemas everywhere from Thursday next week. Whether or not the film has anything to do with the screenplay that we sent, suggesting in great detail an Indiana Jones adventure about crystal skulls to some very close associates of the producers, I couldn't possibly comment at this stage. But needless to say, at the very least, I believe that our book certainly inspired the movie, and there may be more maybe found out about that later. So, I'm going to be talking for about 10 to 15 minutes, and I'm really just going to explain how we first became interested in crystal skulls, how we heard of them, the legend of the crystal skulls, and something of the discovery of the first crystal skull that we heard about. And then I'll hand over to Ceri for about 10 to 15 minutes, and she'll tell you a bit more about what some of the owners of some of the crystal skulls have to say about them. And then back to me for a bit more on the science of the crystal skulls, the tests that have been done on them, and the archaeology behind the crystal skulls, and the ancient civilizations that may or may not have produced them. So, about 13 years ago, I mean, how many people have not heard of crystal skulls at all, incidentally? Anyone, or has everybody now heard of them? Well, that's a great progress since 13 years ago, when even we'd not heard of them. And in fact, our first encounter with the whole idea of crystal skulls really came about when we decided to take, if you like, a holiday of a lifetime and go to Central America. And we were actually visiting this region, which I hope is going to come up here, yes. This is Mexico down to about here, and along there, Guatemala here, Belize up the coast of the Caribbean coast here, and Honduras down here. But long ago, as you can see, this area was actually populated by the originally the Olmecs in the Mexican Gulf, there, the Gulf of Mexico. Later, the Mixtec, Zapotec, and Mayan empires, and then later again, well, actually, Teotihuacans, I'll come back to that later, but the Aztecs, who were there when the Europeans arrived in around about, 1492 and beyond. Ancient cultures in this area, and some beautiful beaches. But we were particularly interested in some of the most beautiful ruins in the world. I don't know how many people may have been to or have heard of a place called Tikal in Guatemala. And we were actually trekking through this beautiful rainforest to get to the ancient ruins. The place then, since then, but at the time, this area was almost in rainforest. And it was absolutely seething with wildlife. And we were absolutely stunned at just the amount of life there was in this place. And then, of course, we were expecting it, but we stumbled upon the ancient ruins of Tikal, buried, as it still is, deep in the rainforest. And this is a Mayan city that once held about 100,000 people, they estimate. And they built these massive pyramids that arise, stepped pyramids, that arise right up above, steep-sided, and go right to pyramids as far as the eye can see. Nothing but rainforest all around. Absolutely beautiful. It's like a paradise, like a land that time forgot, a world we no longer know here in the West. And we were actually on top of one of these pyramids when we noticed a stone-carved skull carved into the side of one of the pyramids. And we asked our guide, what's that about? Human sacrifice or something? Because that's the big, I think, myth about the ancient Maya. We'll get to that later. And he said, well, actually, this skull might be something to do with the crystal skulls. And then he proceeded to explain that there is actually an ancient Native American legend about the crystal skulls. And the legend says that there exist 13 life-size humans, just like human skulls, life-size skulls, just like human skulls, but made of solid crystal. And the legend said that these skulls were containers of great knowledge and wisdom, that they contain information about the past history of the planet, the evolution of mankind, and above all, about our true purpose on this earth and our future destiny. And the legend also prophesied that one day, at a time of great crisis for humanity, that all of these crystal skulls would be rediscovered or would re-emerge and would be brought back together again. And when that time arrived, the information, the knowledge that they contain or that they can help us access would actually be divulged. And the native elders believe that this knowledge is actually vital to the survival of the human race. And another part of the story, the legend, was that mankind, before the skulls re-emerge, humanity had to be sufficiently prepared, sufficiently evolved, both morally and spiritually, so as not to abuse the great knowledge the skulls contain, because in the wrong hands, their power could be abused. And I mean, we thought this was just an incredible tale, you know, like King Arthur and his knights of the Round Table or whatever, although there may, of course, be some truth in that, but, you know, we didn't think that there was any truth in this. And until we actually continued our journey down to the Caribbean coast that I showed you earlier, of Belize, and we actually got chatting to a barman in one of the little coral atolls there, and you know, we asked him if any buried treasure had ever been found, because it was such a kind of, it's a place where pirate chests had ever been found washed up on the shore, but there was something that might be considered a buried treasure that had been found deep in the interior way back in the 1920s. And we were amazed when he told us it was a crystal skull that had been found by, sorry, I've missed a few slides here, I'm getting carried away. This is, of course, this is the famous Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull, and it was said to have been found on an expedition organized by a man called Frederick Mitchell-Hedges back in 1924. Now, Frederick Mitchell-Hedges was a kind of flamboyant, charismatic character. He was a sort of upper-class English adventurer explorer, and some say he's actually one of the role models for the Indiana Jones character. And he was quite unconventional in that, although he was a member of the Maya Committee of the British Museum, he believed that Atlantis was a real civilization that had actually existed, and that its remnants could be found somewhere in the region of Central America. And being the kind of guy he was determined to prove it. So in 1924, he gathered together a whole party of explorers, and they set off from Liverpool, bound for British Honduras. And they were trekking through, sorry, this is the Mitchell-Hedges, I'm forgetting what order my slides are in, but there we go. They were trekking through the rainforest one day when they stumbled upon some mounds of stone overgrown with roots and vines, and they realized they'd found a lost city. And it was a place actually already known to the locals as Luban Tum, which means the city of the fallen stones. And they set about clearing the ruins, excavating, chopping down the rainforest that had grown up on top of the old city, and clearing the site. And Mitchell-Hedges was accompanied on this expedition, amongst other people, by his daughter, Anna Mitchell-Hedges. And she says that she was determined to get to the top of the highest pyramid, partly because she was forbidden to go up there. But one day when everyone was asleep in their hammocks, it's a very hot day, she set off and she climbed up to the top of the highest pyramid. And she looked out at the wonderful view just as we had done at Tikal, rainforest all around. But she said also while she was up there, she thought she saw something almost like glittering or twinkling in her eye coming from down inside the pyramid, which is kind of, you know, strange. So she went back and told her father, and he said he thought she'd imagined it. But the next day, he gathered together a party of his helpers, and they started clearing the stones from the top of the pyramid. And they found an opening that went down inside the pyramid, and they put some, it was too small for an adult to go down, so Anna volunteered, and they put some ropes around her, and a light on her head, and they lowered her down into the pyramid. She said she was very afraid because snakes and scorpions might be down there. But when she got down, she found something, a strange object, very smooth, she couldn't really see in the dark. She wrapped it in her shirt, and they pulled her back up out of the pyramid. And as she emerged into the daylight, everyone could see that what she'd found was this incredible crystal skull. Now, have I got a photo of it coming up? No, I haven't. I've got a photo of me at Dachau, but I think in a minute. This is incidentally, this character here is Frederick Mitchell-Hedges, and this is his daughter Anna, taken in the 1920s in the rainforest. There is some controversy over this story, but this is the spot. Sorry, Ceri, that's an embarrassing shot of Ceri and Dachau. I've got a little confused. You'll soon see a picture of Ceri at the spot where the crystal skull was actually discovered. Sorry, my photo seems to have got a bit jumbled here. But, and at that point, I'd just like to hand you over what she thought of the crystal skulls when we first heard of them and what their owners say about them. And I'll come back to you about archaeology and scientific tests in about 10 minutes. Oh, that one there.
Skulls here with us on the stage as well, so I just think that's a very nice touch there. I'd like to begin with my own reaction to the image of the skull the first time I saw it. But before I tell you about that, I just want to let you know that I'm going to be talking a bit about what skull owners said to us about the crystal skulls when we met them. And I'll be telling you a bit about what Anna Mitchell-Hedges said, and then also the owner of the Houston skull, which is a very, very different crystal skull from the Mitchell-Hedges. So I'll be telling you about that, and also about the findings of a psychic who worked with Mitchell-Hedges' skull. So firstly, I just want to sort of say how I found the image of the skull absolutely mind-blowing. When I first saw the image of the skull, I found it absolutely sort of mesmerising and hypnotic, and it held my attention in the way that no other image has, either sort of before or since. And for me, that was a large part of the motivation for wanting to go on to make a documentary and then to write a book about crystal skulls, was to understand what was the power of this image, why it held my attention so strongly, and why it was so mesmerising. I just couldn't understand it, and I really wanted to understand it. So that's kind of how it began. And we actually met Anna Mitchell-Hedges when we heard about her skull while we were in the ruins of Lubantum in Belize, and we were actually, the guide there gave us her details, and we were able to contact her, and we went to Canada to meet her when she was still alive. She died last year in April, but we were fortunate to meet her and meet the skull, which she kept in her sitting room in a sort of neat suburban house where it sat in her on a velvet cushion. And we were very surprised at the time by her relationship with the skull, which was so sort of personal, and she referred to the skull as he, and it was quite sort of, well, it was very different, but that was kind of something about her relationship with it. She believed that the skull, she lived, to be over 100, and she believed that the skull had healing powers, and actually was one of the reasons why she had, that she lived such a long life. This is a picture of Anna with her skull here.
She was 100 when she died.
She was 100. Sorry, she was 100 when she died. So,
Anna actually believed it gave her a long life.
Yeah, she believed it gave her long life. Now, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about the skull is here we have the image of death, a skull, and yet what we see is something that's filled with light and beauty. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the way that the skull responds to light.
Anna actually believed it gave her a long life.
Yeah, she believed it gave her long life. Now, I think one of the things that's really fascinating about the skull is here we have the image of death, a skull, and yet what we see is something that's filled with light and beauty. And in fact, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the way that the skull responds to light, because it is actually really incredible. There's prisms within the crystal, and they capture the light and they refract it, and it really is very beautiful, as you can see here. The other feature, because I just want to tell you about a couple of features of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, 3 features. One was the light. The second thing that I would like to tell you about is the inclusions inside the skull, which are the tiny, tiny bubbles of air that became trapped deep in the crystal when it was first formed. For people who don't know, crystal is formed deep in the Earth's crust when silica and water meet under tremendous pressure. And at that time, the bubbles get trapped in it, and they look absolutely sort of mesmerisingly beautiful. They're like tiny. When you look inside the skull, they're like little tiny crystals, like tiny stars, sort of sparkling, in a distant galaxy. They're very beautiful. I know they've got them in the British Museum skull as well, so we might actually be able to see some of that in the crystal skulls that are here. Oops, if I go back a minute, that's next, isn't it? The other feature of the Mitchell-Hedges skull, which is really quite unique, is its detachable jawbone. The skull is highly anatomically accurate, and it has a jawbone, just like a real human skull, that slots into it, and it sits upon this separate jawbone. Since we have met a very renowned crystal carver, Jürgen Henn, who appeared in our documentary about crystal skulls, and he has actually managed to make sort of modern replica skulls, but he's tried several times to make a skull with a detachable jawbone, and he's not been able to do that. He's made the jawbone, but he says every time he makes one, it shatters. He keeps trying, but he hasn't been able to reproduce that, and he himself is like, he just doesn't know how that was done, how they could have made one that could sort of hold the weight of the skull and not shatter. So, and that leads me on to one of the questions raised by the jawbone. I mean, why was it the skull created with a separate jawbone? I mean, the legend did refer to the skulls and said that the skulls had been created that could speak or sing. So it's interesting that it does have this movable, detachable jawbone. And one of the theories about the use of the skull is that you can actually, there's two small holes in the Mitchell-Hedges skull underneath the jaw, and you can actually suspend the skull on sticks and manipulate the jaw so it does actually appear to open and close. And, it has been suggested by earlier researchers that, in fact, if you kind of light a source of fire underneath the skull, it shines out through the eyes, and the combined effect of moving these sticks, getting the jaw opening and closing, and the light shining out creates a very sort of terrifying spectacle. And there's some suggestion that the skull was used as in sort of, for a sort of oracular announcements in this sort of menacing, fearful way. But I don't think personally that the skull has anything to do with, terrifying people or fear. In fact, quite the opposite. I mean, Anna Mitchell-Hedges referred to her skull as the skull of love, and she was convinced that it was here, to help people with healing. There you go. I mean, one of the things about the symbol of a skull is its universality. I mean, it speaks to all of us. I mean, we all have the same skull beneath our flesh, and we all face that image of mortality in a way. We're all going to be skulls sooner than we'd like ourselves. That's going to be left of us. But I think there is something about the skulls that speaks to us about the possibilities beyond death. The light, the beauty of the skull is suggesting something about what lies beyond the threshold of death. But that's something that we talk more about in our book. Anna Mitchell-Hedges isn't the only person sort of making claims about the skull's healing and unusual properties. There are many people who have spent time with the Mitchell-Hedges crystal skull and other crystal skulls who report the skulls having kind of odd paranormal effects on them. People have reported seeing images deep within the skull, of having distant memories triggered within its presence, or hearing voices, or all kinds of sort of strange effects can come about around crystal skulls. And in fact, this leads me on to Joanne.
Can I just point out that Anna thought that the crystal skull had healing powers and that it had protected her throughout her life, and she did actually live to 100 years old, which is quite incredible. And she was hopping on and off planes to Belize and so on, right till she was in her 90s, late 90s. So, I mean, she may well have, there may well be something in her idea that the skull has healing powers. Sorry to interrupt.
Don't worry, don't worry. Yeah. So this crystal skull is what's sometimes known as the Houston skull, and it is a very different type of skull. It has none of the very refined, anatomically accurate workmanship that you find on the Mitchell-Hedges skull. It's much sort of cruder in its design, and it's made of what the owner, Joanne, calls junk crystal. It's got sort of, this line down the middle there, and it really looks like it's almost made of two different parts of type of crystal. It's quite kind of clumsy, quite a crude piece of crystal. Now, what surprised us, I think, when we met Joanne was the similarities in what she said about her skull and what Anna had said about her skull, and about this idea that the skulls have a healing purpose. Now, Joanne came across her skull. Is it right? Go back there. Is that my slides? Okay. Oh, where's it going?
Let's go back. Sorry.
Yeah, so Joanne told us that she came across her skull. It's actually it's a sad story about her daughter, who was at the time very ill she had leukemia, and Joanne took her daughter to see a Tibetan healer who was based in Houston at that time, a man called Norbu Chen, and he worked with the skull with her daughter, and her daughter lived a further 3 years with the treatment that he used using the skull. And then sometime after her daughter had died, the healer was retired, and he gave Joanne the skull, and she didn't particularly want it, and so she just put it away in her cupboard and didn't really think much more about it. But then she started having dreams where the skull would appear, and then she started hearing what she thought was the voice of the skull speaking to her, saying, "Hey, get me out of here, get me out of here." And she really thought she was going completely crazy. So in the end, the skull said to her, "Get me out of here. And by the way, my name's not Skull, it's Max." So it was a crystal skull with a bit of sense of humour. So she got Max out and never looked back, and has since, toured with Max and has people come to her home to sit with Max. And she, like I said, she gives great emphasis to the his healing powers. And in fact, one of the things he said to her was, "My name is Max, and I will be remembered." So there you are. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand you over to Chris. Oh, so to Carol Wilson. Yeah. Okay, before I do that. Yeah, Chris is going to be talking about the scientific and archaeological kind of investigations that have been carried out on the skulls. But before he does that, I would just like to report of one of the women, a woman we met who had worked with the Mitchell-Hedges skull, who kind of got information about the skull in quite a different way. Her name was Carol Wilson, and she's one of Canada's leading psychics. And she worked with the crystal skull psychically. When she first went to see the skull, she said, actually quite disappointed. She thought it was going to have some mind-blowing effect, and did. What it was, she'd been into a trance, and she had relayed information that she said had come from the skull. So, we filmed, we had in our documentary. And you can actually read about them in today's Daily Mail. But it's very interesting, some of the information that Carol, she had reams of stuff that she came out with. But just from what the information from her, I thought was quite sort of, it's thought-provoking, so I thought I'd share it with you. She said that the skulls had been created using the power of the mind alone. They'd been created used by thought, and that they represented the minds of many, and the minds of one. Skulls had actually been created in another dimension. So there's all kinds of information she then went on to give us about various prophecies that she got from the skull, which you can read about in our book, which were very very interesting and chilling stuff. I'll go into that now. But anyway, just to share with you a little bit about what Carol found out from her work with the skull. And now I'll hand back to Chris, who'll tell you all about the archaeological and scientific investigations into the skull. Thank you.
Well, it emerged that there were actually as well as the Mitchell-Hedges skull and Max, the skull in Texas, there was actually some skulls in some of the world's most famous museums. For example, there's a skull in the British Museum. This is it here. And it's actually almost as anatomically accurate as the Mitchell-Hedges skull, although it doesn't have the detachable lower jaw. And its eyes are more indicated rather than, the Mitchell-Hedges skull is exactly like a human skull, of course, separate jaw and cranium, whereas this has got the fixed jaw, but and slightly more cloudy crystal, but still a very, very nice piece. And it turned out that there were all kinds of strange tales surrounding this skull as well. Apparently, people at the British Museum thought they'd seen it moving around by itself in its sealed glass case, and the cleaners were so afraid of it they wouldn't go anywhere near it. And but when we spoke to the archaeologists at the British Museum, it turned out that this skull has actually been in the possession of the British Museum since 1898. And it had actually been bought by the British Museum from Tiffany's in New York. And apparently it had come from Mexico and been brought by a Mexican soldier of fortune who had come into possession of it during the Mexican Civil War. And there are even rumors it may once have been in the cabinet of the Mexican president, Porfirio Diaz, I think it was at the time. So there was, the skulls were getting even more intriguing, because then it also turned out that there was a skull, I think there's a picture of it coming up. Now that's another shot of the British Museum skull. But also there was a skull in the Smithsonian institution in Washington, and this is it here. And this was a really strange skull because it's huge. It's absolutely ginormous. It's almost like a motorbike crash. It's about this size, and it's actually hollow, so someone can actually put their head inside it. It's almost like a huge mask, and it's made from very cloudy crystal. And I sometimes think it looks as though it's got the profile of a Neanderthal on it. But the keeper of this skull, a woman called Dr. Jane Walsh, she said what was really strange about this skull is that ever since it came into her possession, and there's a story there, it had seemed to attract other skulls. Lots of people kept saying, I've got a crystal skull, can I bring it in for you to see? And it seemed that crystal skulls were beginning to emerge as, the legend said that one day the skulls would be rediscovered, that they would re-emerge into human consciousness. And what was really interesting is that this is what seemed to be happening. There was unfortunately a very sad tale also behind this skull in terms of the person that sent it in had some personal tragedies after they after they came into possession of the skull, and they sent it into the Smithsonian Museum, and then Jane Walsh couldn't actually get hold of them because apparently they'd taken their own life, which is awful. And there is a debate about whether, as Ceri mentioned, the skulls are good or evil. I mean, Frederick Mitchell-Hedges apparently referred to his skull, the Mitchell-Hedges skull, as the skull of doom, and said it had been used to will death. Whereas his daughter, Anna, said it was quite the opposite, and that he was joking, and that it was actually the skull of love, and it was here to help raise human consciousness. But anyway, so there was a skull in the British Museum, there's another one in the Smithsonian Institution, and we spoke to the Smithsonian British Museum and decided to try and bring the skulls together for scientific tests, and you can read more about that in the book. But we cooperated with them. We were working, making a documentary for the BBC, got the Smithsonian and the British Museum to bring together as many skulls as possible, if not to divulge, their secrets, then certainly to find out how old they were. And it turned out that the Mitchell-Hedges skull, I forgot one, or one of the ones. This is the skull from the Musée de l'Homme in Paris. And it is widely believed to be Aztec, and in fact it has, it's smaller than the others, and it has a drill hole right through it. It's believed that at one time it had a cross skewered through it, because one theory is that when the conquistadors arrived in Central America, they took the symbol of the old religion of the native people, which was represented by the crystal skull, and they impaled their religion through the top of it in the form of a Christian cross. And there's actually a very interesting crystal skull in Mexico City that belongs to a woman named Norma Redu. It's smaller again, but it has a cross still through it. And I'll tell you that the British Museum test found that the cross had a hallmark on it dated to 1561. So therefore that particular reliquary cross skull is quite likely to be pre-Columbian or very early after the conquest. But anyway, what we found out was that the Mitchell-Hedges skull had in fact been tested by the Hewlett-Packard Computer Company. And they tried to date the skull, and they couldn't actually do so because they couldn't carbon date it, because crystal's actually got no carbon in it. It doesn't corrode or decay or anything with age, so absolutely impossible to carbon date it. So they looked for tool marks to try and work out how it had been made, and under extreme magnification they could find no sign of any tool marks. Now, the other thing that was interesting is that they immersed the skull in a tank of benzyl alcohol, which is of the same refractive index as quartz crystal. And what they discovered was that the cranium and the jaw were actually made from the same piece of crystal. And as Ceri was saying, this is an incredibly difficult thing to do. They could tell by the grain structure, like grains in a tree, that it was natural crystal, not manufactured, because now we can manufacture crystal. But this was natural crystal that had grown in the earth over thousands, if not millions of years, and then had somehow been either carved or what, we don't know, into the shape of a crystal skull with a separate jaw and a separate cranium. And they were amazed at this. They said this couldn't be done with modern tools. And they estimated that it must have been carved by hand, and they said it could take 300 man-years of effort to do that. And one of the team actually said the skull shouldn't even exist. So unable to find tool marks and assumed that it was probably made by hand. But one that I think of the most interesting things they also discovered at Hewlett-Packard, because of course they're experts in crystal, is that the skull wasn't made from any old piece of crystal. It was made from a particular type of crystal that we now use every day in all our modern electronics. Because it's made from the type of material that is known to the scientists as quartz crystal. It's known as piezo, it's silicon dioxide. It's a particular type known as piezoelectric silicon dioxide. In other words, the type of quartz crystal we now use in microprocessors, in the silicon crystal chip inside a computer or inside your mobile phone. So that got us really interested in the idea that, well, if you think about how much information we now store inside the silicon crystal chip, inside our computers, on the internet, etc., then just think how much information might, as the legend said, be stored or could be accessed through the crystal skull. The mind boggles. So that is one of the things I think is most interesting that the Hewlett-Packard team discovered. And you can read more about that, obviously, in the book, and I think Philip's going to say a bit more about that tomorrow as well. But I also want to look at whether the crystal skulls may have originated with the ancient cultures of Central America. As I say, the culture that was still there when the European conquerors arrived was the Aztecs, and they had skull imagery everywhere in their artwork. Pottery skulls, clay skulls. Many of their gods were actually represented by skulls. In fact, one of their main gods, the great god of death, Mictlantecutli he was called, was represented by the image of a skull. Sorry, that was him a minute ago. This is Mictlantecutli. But many of their gods were. This is Tezcatlipoca, the god of war, and he's represented by a real human skull with this jade and obsidian mosaic on it. And one of the things about the Aztecs is that the European conquerors said that when they first arrived in Central America and went into the great city that was called Tenochtitlan, it's now an incredible city, far more sophisticated than any city in Europe of the time. But the Europeans said, the conquistadors, Cortes and so on, said that when they went into the main square, that people were being sacrificed at the top of these pyramids. And after the sacrifice, they were being led up the steps to the top of the pyramid, and then they were being laid back on a sacrificial stone. And then the priest would come and stand over them with an obsidian blade, that's a type of very sharp volcanic rock turned into a blade, and they would while singing incantations to the gods, they would plunge this blade into the victim's chest and rip out their heart while it was still beating and hold it up to the sun god. And when they were finished, apparently they threw the victim down the steps of the pyramids and hacked them into little pieces and decapitated them, and people ate bit parts of their body. Now, it's actually very controversial as to whether or not this really happened, or it's becoming controversial, because if you think about it, the Spanish conquerors arrived in Central America and actually created mass genocide. And their reports of the original inhabitants, I personally think, are not necessarily to be entirely trusted. It's a bit like asking the SS and the Gestapo to write a report on what the Jews were like. So the reports from the Spanish about what the indigenous people were doing when they arrived, I don't think are entirely reliable. But that is what many conventional archaeologists believe. Oh, have I? Sorry. Okay. So as I say, many indigenous people now say that what was really going on with these images of skulls was not that they were trophies of war or sacrificial victims, but they were actually a way of marking out the passage of time. Because as many of you probably know, the ancient Mesoamericans were obsessed with time and the great cycles of time, and were very accurate in their prediction, in their calendrics and their prophetic, in their predictions. And that what this was more like an abacus, where the skulls represented a generation of generations past. And in fact, I think, if I've got it coming up, that wasn't quite what I'm looking for, but this is an image painted later, actually, of some sacrificial victims being prepared for sacrifice. But what I was looking for was this, that actually most of the skulls that now survive, these stone-carved skulls, are actually, the natives say, that each of these skulls represents a generation of time that has passed since what they call the beginning of the current world. You see, the ancient Mesoamericans, that's the Aztecs, the Maya, and their neighbors, believed that the world has been created and destroyed several times in the past, and that these skull images, each one represents a generation which was rounded to the nearest, how long generations last, about 52 years. So each skull represented a 52-year period since the beginning of time until, let's say, this monument was built. So this monument here is saying that it's this many generations since the beginning of time, or the beginning of this current world. And I don't know if you know, but the ancient Maya and their neighbors had a very sophisticated calendar, much more scientifically accurate than our own. Because whereas our calendar is just like a solar year, and so many years before or after Christ has died, so it's like a linear calendar almost, or there's a solar year, but into the past and back in the past that way, back in the future that way. The Maya actually had 17 different interlocking calendars, because what their calendars were about, each calendar was a cycle, and each cycle represented not only when today is, but where today is relative to the other planets and stars. So the 17 different counts of what day it was told you where the Earth was relative to not just the sun like our calendar, but also the moon. Venus was another important planet, and star clusters, several star clusters were included, particularly the star cluster of the Pleiades. So their calendar was a series of interlocking, you have to imagine it as interlocking wheels, like the planets and the stars and the Earth revolving around the sun and revolving around each other. And they used this calendar, in which the image of the skull was important, to make the most stunningly accurate predictions. The Maya were actually, let me just give you another slide here. The Maya were actually able to predict, for example, eclipses. They predict eclipses they couldn't even see that were happening on the other side of the planet. They predicted eclipses that happened over 1,000 years after their civilization collapsed and disappeared. And they predicted an eclipse over Mexico City in 1992, and it happened exactly on the day that they said it would. And of course, the thing that's most worrying for us is, I'll come back to it in a minute, is that the Maya predicted that the current world, which they say began precisely, they're very precise on what translates into our calendar as the 13th of August, 3114 BC. They say the current world will end on the 21st of December, 2012. And with all these skull images in their calendrical predictions, I think they might have been trying to warn us about something. So I'll just, Ceri's pointing out, we want to leave time for questions. How are we doing for time? Are we all right? Another 5 or 10 minutes. Sorry, this is a carved stone head left behind by the Olmecs, the Maya's predecessors, way several hundred years BC, just to show the extent of the carving skills that these people had and that they were into carving. Oh, hold on a second. My apologies, going the wrong way. And this is the ancient city of Teotihuacan, which is near Mexico City, and comes from the Aztecs' predecessors. And the reason this is quite interesting because the great city of Teotihuacan has 3 great pyramids, 2 of which survive. One of them actually never got finished. But there's the Pyramid of the Sun, the Pyramid of the Moon, and the Temple of Quetzalcoatl, who was the god of Central America. And these are aligned, if you actually look at the layout, just like the 3 pyramids at Giza, in the same pattern as the 3 stars of Orion's belt. So for those of you that are into astronomical alignments, this is also even more interesting because not only have we got the 3 pyramids, Temple of the Moon, look at the Temple of the Sun. I know you're telling me I'm going on too long. So Pyramid of the Moon, look at the Pyramid of the Sun with the base of the Temple of Quetzalcoatl in the background that never got built. And running down the middle, unlike Giza in Egypt, there's this huge, what's been called the Avenue of the Dead. And one of the several interesting things about this city is that underneath the Temple of the Sun here was found back in the 1970s an entrance that goes right in underneath the pyramid. And there was an entrance to some secret chambers that no one had known about till the 70s that were underneath the pyramid in Teotihuacan. And things about this in terms of alignments. If you look at the Avenue of the Dead, it's actually aligned with a point on the far horizon where the Pleiades star cluster arose at dawn on the date I mentioned earlier, the beginning of the current world, 3114 BC. And this skull is pointing at another point on the horizon, at an angle to it, that actually coincides with the spot where the Pleiades will set against the horizon on the date I mentioned earlier. So as I say, I think they were trying to tell us something. And that, so the Aztecs, the Teotihuacanos, and then this is the Maya, who were the utmost experts in the ancient calendar. And this is their Temple of the Inscriptions in Palenque. We're okay. Where in fact, this is southern Mexico, and it's one of the great Mayan pyramids, which we explored at Ceri's great embarrassment, to find images of a skull, of course, everywhere. And one of the interesting things about Palenque here, this Mayan temple, is that inside the Temple of the Inscriptions, in behind skulls like this, in 1952, a man named Alberto Ruse, thank you, was standing inside the temple when he noticed rough stones on the floor and he scraped away and found what looked like stoppers that came away. And the whole paving stone lifted away, and he found what was in fact a secret entrance inside the pyramid. And going down there, he didn't actually find any crystal skulls, but as anyone who's read Eric von Daniken will know, he found what is now widely known as the Tomb of Dachau, Lord Dachau. And von Daniken took this as evidence of alien contact with humanity. Read more about it in the books, I'm running out of time. I have no idea why that picture suddenly turned up there. I think someone dropped my slide box. But inside the Tomb of Dachau was found a 7-foot tall character, far taller than any Mayan has ever been known to be, which has led to all kinds of speculation about transatlantic contact or even perhaps extraterrestrial contact, which is one, of course, of the themes that many people have suggested in trying to explain the crystal skulls. I just want to quickly, Ceri, if you don't mind, are we all right for time? 5 minutes, okay. Explain that some of the research we did into ancient Mayan stone carvings, this is an ancient carved stone lintel from a city called Yaxchilan in southern Mexico. And what it shows is a Mayan noble, a woman here named as Lady Zoc, in 748 AD, I believe, on the something of August 18th, I think it was. And she's holding what is actually a skull. And she's performing a kind of self-sacrifice ceremony, because what the native people say, it did happen. It's not this massive involuntary sacrifice of victims, but people performing their own kind of sacrifice, bloodletting sacrifices, to bring on a kind of altered state of consciousness that could help them access the other dimensions they believed in. You see, if you talk to Mayan elders today, they say that the crystal skulls are actually a doorway into other dimensions, a means of accessing other dimensions that exist alongside our own, kind of like parallel universes, if you like. And if this sounds hard to get your head around, just think about the fact that every day when you go to a computer and communicate through a piece of crystal with another dimension, the internet, the whole site of cyberspace is in fact really a parallel dimension, because it takes up no physical space in our world, and yet we can access it through a piece of crystal in a computer or in a mobile phone sometimes, but certainly in a computer. We are already effectively using crystal to access other dimensions, or the other dimension of cyberspace. And the Maya have been doing this for millennia. They were doing this way, way back. They say that they use a crystal skull to access the parallel universes, or rather the other dimensions that exist alongside our own. And this carved stone lintel from the city of Yaxchilan shows a Mayan noble here, Lady Zoc, holding a skull, which may well be a crystal skull, performing a bloodletting ritual to create an altered state of consciousness, to enter a trance-like state. And the idea was that the Maya believed they could use the skulls to communicate with the spirits, with the ancestors, because they believed that through communicating with this other dimension, they could actually communicate, as I say, with the spirits and the ancestors. And the spirits and the ancestors, in their dimension, there's no time, no fixed space like in ours. So they could see into the past, they could see into the future. And they believed they could actually talk to the ancestors through the skulls and access. This is what's called a vision serpent, very elaborate, emerging from a skull, probably a crystal skull. And from the jaws of this vision serpent, this is the way the Maya saw the world, is coming an ancestor of Lady Zoc's, and he's coming to try to warn her about, I think it's the planet Venus, actually. I think that's the symbol of the planet Venus with that shield and spear. So that's what the Maya believed, that the skulls could help them access these other dimensions and help them gain information about the future. And that's what led to their major predictions. To allow time for questions, Ceri's wrapping me up. Just quickly, the great Mayan city of Chichen Itza. All Mayan cities had pyramids aligned with the planets and the stars, and that embodied the calendrical system. The temple of Kukulkan, the Spanish call it El Castillo, has got 365 steps. It's got alignments so that the corners point to the equinoxes and the solstice and so on. And in fact, they built observatories, the ancient Maya built observatories like this one here, the Caracol at Chichen Itza. And it looks almost like a modern observatory, like a Greenwich or something. And they used this to observe the planets and the stars. There's incredible alignments inside the Caracol here. If there's windows cut in little slitty windows cut in certain places. And it's not for defense, it's to work out exactly when the Pleiades or Venus are in certain places. And at risk of reiterating, this is, again, more pictures of the observatories used to measure the planets and the stars to make the predictions about the future. And I'll just skim over that. This is the skull at the center. This is an image, an ancient manuscript from, God, I can't remember the date, but it's in the book, about 200 BC, I believe, around about that. And it's sorry? Thank you. It's from the Dresden Codex, and it shows the Mayas' concept of the 4 previous worlds. These are each of the previous worlds, each ruled over by a different lord. They incidentally said that the first world was ruled over by giants who ate our nourishment. Now, some people believe this is like a reference to the age of the dinosaurs because they're giants. And in fact, there is some evidence in the fossil record for this idea that the Maya had, that the world has been created and destroyed certain times in the past. If you look at the fossil record, since the Cambrian period, there have been 4 previous worlds, as they say, in terms of periods during which life on Earth has grown and blossomed and there's been species diversification. And then all of a sudden, a line in the fossil record where just about everything on Earth is wiped out, and then nothing for ages, until eventually, many millennia later, millions of years later, life starts to begin and blossom again, and then is wiped out again. Okay, so I personally believe that the Maya, this is incident, we're trying to warn us about our own future. And the native elders that we spoke to in Guatemala believe that the skulls are re-emerging level of functioning, that we need to evolve to a higher level of a species, as a species, in order not to wipe ourselves out. And I'll just leave you with an image that some say is a UFO appearing inside a crystal skull. Something like that. Oh, 9 elders, sorry, praying that the skulls will return to help us. Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.